This is my first video lecture, and I thought that I would give this a try. It's spring break. I hope that you guys are having a wonderful time, some downtime. As promised, I decided to record a lecture for you on how to write. And as we're learning how to write, I want you to remember a couple of things. I'm not your English professor. I'm not your English teacher. Hell, I barely speak English myself. But since we have to communicate and we have to write, and to get out of my class, you have to write to me in English, I think I might give you a few suggestions. I don't only think that these suggestions are going to aid you in this particular course. I think that they will likely aid you and assist you in other courses as well. There's a quote from Ernest Hemingway. I think this is interesting. Otherwise, I wouldn't say it, right? But writing is easy. All you have to do is sit at a typewriter and bleed. 95% of writing does not occur with a keyboard or one of these anachronistic devices, a pen. 95% of writing doesn't occur while you're sitting at a desk. 95% of writing occurs when you're out and about in the world. 95% of writing happens up here. That's where 95% of research happens. Scribbling it down, that's what people usually think about when they think about writing. And as we're talking about writing today, I wanted to go a little bit into depth on what will make this easier for you and what will make this easier for the person who is subject to what you're giving them. And I'm not a great writer. It takes years and years. You're not going to be a great writer. I'm a serviceable writer, and you're probably on your way there. When people write, they often think that it's a matter of, I have to sound impressive. I have to use big words. I have to be flowery and verbose, and it's my task to impress you by the sophistication of my lexicography. And a great writer does not do that. Here's what a great writer does. A great writer doesn't make you go looking for anything. A great writer will show you rather than tell you. And when you are writing, a lot of times when you're early in your academic career or your writing pursuits, you're going to likely do a lot more telling than showing. And what I mean by that is saying how good of a writer you are or using those large, big, flowery words. It's cute, it's overdone. But if you can show me that you know what you're talking about and I don't have to go searching for it, I'm going to be happier. Everyone who grades you, everyone who reads your writing from this point forward is going to thank you. Because if you think about it from the perspective of the person who is evaluating you, well, you just spent hours and hours and hours and hours putting something together, oftentimes that you didn't really care to write. You might have used ChatGPT or another AI LLM thing. The fact of the matter is, everyone's going to rush and hand in dozens of poorly written things that they didn't want to write necessarily to someone who is going to have to read all of them. And they're messy, they meander, they are full of extraneous detail that doesn't get right to the point. And then to someone who is in my position, who grades, who evaluates, I get a bit annoyed, and so does everyone else, because we have a lot of these things to read. And yeah, that's the task that I signed up for, is reading a lot of student papers. But I would be happier if people spent less time trying to impress me by how pretty their language is, and blows me away by how profound their ideas are. In my lecture today, I'm going to talk about this process called plug and chug. I'm going to talk about logic and reasoning. I'm going to talk about probability. I want you to be a great writer. I wish this on you. I I want to curse you with the burden of being a good writer, because if you have become a great writer, you have to write. You have to share your ideas. And as always, I'm not an English professor. I'm not an English teacher. I'm not a creative writing instructor. I don't do any of that. I'm in favor of hiring an editor. Of course, honing my skills to get to the point where I don't need an editor per se, but I want to just hand off making it look pretty to other people. And with you, where you are at, or where you likely are at in your process of learning how to write, I don't care if it's perfect. I don't care. I absolutely am ambivalent to it being slightly messy in terms of looking pretty. I would rather have your ideas be messy, even if you outline them a little bit, and you explore and you give me something profound that resonates, that demonstrates you were paying attention, that demonstrates mastery of the material, that's demonstrable of the fact that you actually gave a damn and you went a few steps further. You bring in someone else into your paper that we didn't talk about in the curriculum, and it fits well, and it causes me to say, huh, or whoa, where did they get that? How did they know about this particular author? I never even thought about that. It fits. Something like that is going to be astoundingly great. That's what I'm looking for. And if it's messy, if there's a couple spelling errors, I don't care. If there's a little bit of grammatical mess, I don't care. I don't have time to correct your writing in terms of that. My job is to get you to understand politics. My job is to get you to have a working vocabulary for the social and behavioral sciences. We'll let your English instructors clean up your writing to make it look pretty. That's their job. Our job is to be brilliant. Our job is to look at politics. Our job is to look at this big, messy dumpster fire of a planet with these crazy little primates running around holding court as the interesting, beautiful, wonderful creatures that we are, and to understand them, and to understand how we interact in our institutions, and to understand how to make sense of this big, big mess that we call institutions, that we call markets, that we call politics. And to do so, we have to look for patterns. We have to look for patterns. We need specific information to back up what we're looking at in terms of patterns, but we're trying to make sense of patterns. Ultimately, in political science or the social sciences or science in general, that's what we're going for. We're looking for patterns and we're looking to make sense out of it. My mentor, and one of the most brilliant people I've ever met, Ron King, he he would talk about the fact that in our discipline. We are in the olds, OLDS, olds business. We aren't in the news business. People in the news business are all about novelty, about freaking you out, and for the most part now, about getting you. It's almost less and less about selling you what the sponsors are during the commercial break, trying to sell you, and more about getting you integrated to their social media infrastructure and ecosystem, so you're the product now, to scare you, to keep your amygdala plugging and chugging, to keep cortisol coursing through your veins so you're constantly paranoid, freaked out, turning against each other, just so you'll be hooked. It's like a drug, it's relying on your dopamine channels. And that's the news business. We're the olds business. We're here to look at what's happened over the course of time. We're here to look at what the things that have happened over the course of time potentially mean. And we're here to make sense of it all. At least that's what I'm trying to do. I'm seeing if this is still recording. What? Is it? Yes. Good. All right. This was on my watch, so I'm getting used to this. All right. And as I was saying, as I was saying, hold on. Oop. Good. There we are. I have it on my watch. I like this. And it went off of my watch, so I didn't know if it was still recording. Regardless. So to understand how to write, there's several things that we need to understand. We need to understand logic and reasoning. We need to understand persuasion and rhetoric, and we need to understand probability. And I know that you did not necessarily sign up for this course as a quote unquote writing course, but when you do the social and behavioral sciences, it's largely a writing enterprise. I love it. Here's why I absolutely adore this. It's because with the physical sciences, you might not be necessarily in the system of a bullet traveling through the air and trying to determine exactly how quickly it's getting there, the amount of air resistance. You could be removed from that particular venture. But with political science, some people say that we're not a science. Some people say that we're more of an art. This is a question for later, talking about um, the the quantifiable versus the quantitative, or quality versus quantitative. So the categorical versus the quantitative. And however you think about what we're doing in political science and government, American government isn't necessarily political science, it's more civics. But however you're thinking about it, I want you to think from the perspective that you're a part of this thing that you're studying. And being a part of this thing that you're studying, there's going to be bias. There's going to be things that you're going to overlook because you're influenced by what we're looking at. And this can help us and hurt us. It can help us from the perspective of you might have a keen insight that might not be readily available. If you have a secret code among your friends, if you have inside jokes, it demonstrates that you've been initiated into something. And someone else might look at your inside jokes where you're just like, oh, fuck, I can't think of something good right now. Let's say that there's some kind of dirty inside joke involving peanut butter, and every time the term peanut butter comes up, everyone in the group just starts giggling. And someone from outside the group is going to say, Why are you giggling about peanut butter? And everyone just starts giggling when you say peanut butter. And it's because you covered your friend's car in peanut butter one day and it got covered in seagulls. That was a prank that you pulled or something. I don't know. It's arbitrary. I don't know what you guys do. I'm not going to judge you. Well, I am going to judge you, but and from that, you have an insider knowledge. Or let's say that you're Muslim and you're inviting a friend to mosque on Friday who knows nothing about Islam. And let's say that when they come in, they don't know to take their shoes off, or they don't know where to go. They don't know about men in the front, women in the back. Or let's say that you're Catholic and you take a friend to Mass and they're completely unfamiliar with the calisthenic routine of stand up, sit down, you know. Or you take someone in to play a sport and they don't know what they're doing. So it might be more difficult for you to think critically about your own religion or your sport, which in a lot of ways is a religion. It might be more difficult, profoundly more difficult, to think about something that shapes you, that you cherish far more critically than an outsider, because your own sense of identity is inherently tied to this particular membership that you have. But when we're talking about this membership that you have an insight that gives you a bit of a rarefied air when you're talking about it that an outsider might not know. But at the same time, if we're trying to gauge the parameters of your particular membership, you might have a sectarian disagreement with someone else who worships in a slightly different way. If you're Catholic, you might not recognize a Mormon or a Latter Day Saints or a Pentecostal service in the same way. Or if you are, you know, Shiite, you might not completely recognize a Sunni service. And it's an interesting joke. Interesting joke. So we also tend to fall into factions. We talked about this during Madison, and with factions, there's this joke about this Jewish man who got stranded on a deserted island for 3 years. He was cast away on this desert island for 3 years. He was finally rescued, and when he was rescued, his rescuers who picked him up noticed that he built two synagogues. And when he was asked, why two? There's only one of you on the island. And he said, well, this is the synagogue that I go to, and that's the synagogue that I don't go to. With this, you have bias, and your biases will keep you locked in particular notions, particular contrivances. And it might be difficult. It might be really difficult. And this is why we study logic and we study reasoning, because it's important to know our biases. And especially when it comes to politics. If we look at politics, politics, more than many other things that you can engage in, has a tendency to get you to be very angry, to get your visceral anger flowing. And if this is the case, we need to understand this, because if we're talking about politics from a critical angle, um, it might be difficult for us to give a stirring argument or something of a descriptive nature, because we're trying to advocate rather than merely describe. We're trying to protect and be a custodian rather than trying to add a broader generalized insight, because ultimately what we're thinking about doing is finding patterns in the general and trying to make sense of it. The news doesn't do that. The news looks at novelty. We look at the general, try to find patterns, try to make sense of it. This is more for a 101, but you're in the 102 American government. Let's talk about rhetoric. How much do you know about rhetoric? I'm going to give you several types of rhetorical flourishes and argumentation. On the exam that we have, which presumably is why you're watching this video, we have some questions that are asking you to argue. They're asking you to argue from a particular perspective. Let's see which one. This one? Cool. All right. So I want to think about a couple of things. All right. So we're talking about rhetoric. We want to make an argument. We want to make a claim and substantiate that claim. And ideally, we would like that claim to make sense. Not only make sense, but we want the claim to be true. And we want to gather our conclusions from what the world says and seek the world on its own terms instead of just trying to create something to justify our own feelings. With this, regardless of what you're trying to do, be more objective or be more tied to your own idea, we have several rhetorical devices. Let's see, sit up there. Like I said, I am trying to do this for the first time, so if you can't see it, that's my fault. Okay, let's see. Cool. Rhetoric. Yeah, and I blame you because you didn't tell me it was up too high. Rhetoric. So with rhetoric, we're going to have three primary types of rhetoric that we talk about when we talk about argumentation: ethos, logos, pathos. Each of these are equally wonderful depending on what you want to do. This is in your toolbox. This is in your rhetorical toolbox. Ethos. Ethos is arguing from authority. You're an authority on the subject. It's arguing from who's saying it. We do this a lot because we cite sources, but those sources often are cited because of how well they did under logos or logic. Logic is another form of rhetoric. So logos, not logic, sorry. Logic, authority, and emotion. There's different times that you would use these. If you're trying to persuade someone to move to action, unless you're saying that you're going to get beaten down by the authority, or you're dealing with someone who's more of a stoic who thinks in logic, maybe someone with Asperger's, I don't know. You're probably going to go from pathos. Pathos relies on emotions, and we are emotional creatures. I forgot if we've talked about the Enlightenment versus the Romantic period. I think we did that, where the Enlightenment was these classical liberal intellectuals who saw us as mechanical animals, who looked at proofs, who looked at the world in terms of a clockwork, like a fine Swiss watch, one of those watches with all the gears, looking at that and seeing how things worked. The people of the Romantic period that followed the Enlightenment looked at us as emotional creatures, and we are deeply emotional creatures. You might sometimes think that, especially if you try to be more in your head and you try to be more of an academic, you might try to think of us as looking at these pure, unfettered ideas and these lofty ideas and ideals. But when it comes right down to it, we are messy, emotional creatures, especially when it comes to politics. I've worked on a number of political campaigns, And in terms of getting people to vote, we don't talk about these things when we talk to voters. You know why? Because you don't drive people. You go to emotion. In canvassing, when you're getting people knocking on doors trying to get people to vote for a particular candidate, you exclude this stuff because people might not necessarily agree with this sector of authority and they might not agree with going by logic, but we don't do rational, we do relational. This is how we connect. So don't assume that pathos is necessarily bad because it plays to emotion. In fact, it's incredibly powerful. It's like a drug. People are craving to feel something. People are craving to feel something. So we have logos, ethos, and pathos. If you're trying to compel someone to consider something, if someone's more academic minded, logos and ethos are going to be there. If someone is looking for more order, they might prefer ethos. There used to be these commercials for chewing gum, and those commercials for chewing gum, and also before then, it was cigarettes, and it would say something like 4 out of 5 doctors prefer Chesterfields for the relaxing sensation, or 9 out of 10 dentists agree. Which, who the hell's that one dentist that disagrees? I want to meet them. I bet they're fun. Mm. They probably have prescribed a small African bird like a crocodile to pick the things out of your teeth. But we want to argue and we want to make sure that what we're saying in our essays follow a particular path of logic. And you may have never thought about logic before. You may have never thought about how things make sense. You might have. And if you have, then I'm wasting your time and I apologize. But for everyone else, I want to think about these things because considering inference, considering deduction and ampliative arguments, those being induction and abduction, it will help you with everything that you write from this point forward. One of my goals in teaching you and teaching anyone else is I don't want a single person that comes through and is one of my students to leave unable to do the basic work of writing. I also want it to be known that if someone knows that they studied under me, that they're leaving really strong and they know what they're talking about. I think that's the hallmark of a good instructor or professor is that your students leave with a little piece of you and then they spread it around. And I brought up my mentor earlier on in this lecture, Ron King. And Ron imparted a lot to me. And sometimes I talk to my friends who also took Dr. King's classes. And I just said, I think I've become Ron, you know. And I don't know if Ron's ever going to see this, but he had such a major impact on my teaching and my thinking. And I have nothing but the greatest esteem and gratitude. I can never repay that. Anyway, we look at this, and I want to look at logic and reasoning. Logic and reasoning. If we're making arguments, and I hope you are making arguments because that's part of the exam, and that's going to be part of the semester project and your second exam, and it's going to be part of a lot of other things you're going to do in this life. And it's not just so you can get a good grade and you can get a decent job, ideally, if there still are decent jobs, besides going online and giving makeup tips. I want you to do this because it's going to help you. It's going to help you from the perspective of it will be far more difficult for someone to take advantage of you if you can understand, if they're trying to convince you of something, that it just doesn't make sense. In journalism, they say it doesn't pass the smell test. So, looking at my notes, I want to look at logic and reasoning, formal and informal. Firstly, I would like to talk about deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is mathematical in nature. Well, they're all mathematical, but with deductive reasoning, you're looking at the whole, the broad spectrum of something, and you're finding one constituent component element of it, and you're making an assumption based on the individual from the whole. It's top down, and we discussed this in class the other day. And the thing that I would like you to consider on this, and let me pull up my camera so I can see where this thing is. Okay. Okay. So, where's this? Okay. So, deduction. Deduction, to deduce. So, syllogism. Syllogistic reasoning. Syllogism. Syllogism. So, we're looking at the whole, and then we're trying to make inferences about the particular. We're trying to understand the particular from the whole. And the most common one, and you probably saw this in an earlier math class when you were in elementary or junior high school about modus ponens and modus tollens logic. We're not going to go into all the Latin terms, but we're looking at the premises. So we have a major premise and we have a minor premise, and we have a conclusion. If this, then that, therefore that. The most common, and this is the one everyone uses, so I think it's my responsibility to um, just replicate this like everyone does. So it's all men are mortal. Okay? All men are mortal. All men are mortal. Okay, we get that. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Excellent. So, from the big to the particular, so we can understand. We can understand the qualities of a thing based on the qualities of everything, from the top down. This is deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning. It doesn't mean that it's going to be true. There's a difference between validity and soundness. And those two terms again, and I brought them up in class the other day. Validity, sound. So with our example here, valid arguments add up. This adds up. The premises, major premise, minor premise, it adds up. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That adds up. Here's something else that's a valid argument. This is an absolutely valid argument. Major premise. All animals with four legs are cats. And I'm going to disturb my baby. Come here, mama, come here. Come here, look, look. All right, so do you see this? This is an example. Do you see this creature? Oh, you're pretty. Oh, you're pretty. She's so pretty. She is pretty. This is Ruby. I woke her up for this. See this? Look, two legs, two legs. You see that, right? Two legs, two legs. So I got my dog. She doesn't think she's a dog. She thinks she's a person. But, right, baby? This is Ruby. I love Ruby. Everybody else wants Ruby. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for the demonstration. All animals with four legs are cats. Ruby is a dog, and she has four legs. So therefore, Ruby equals cat. And I know this is stupid. It just comes off as stupid. And like I said, one of the things in my teaching, I hate arbitrary things. I hate things that are stupid. And this comes off as stupid, but this is the most elementary of all concepts. So, a valid argument is when the premises add up to the conclusion. This is a valid argument. All animals with four legs are cats. Ruby, the dog, has four legs, so therefore, in a valid argument, Ruby's a cat. From the perspective of a valid argument, Ruby is a cat. But we know that Ruby is a dog. Ruby, you're a good girl. Ruby's a good girl, and that is objectively true. Ruby doesn't think that she's a dog. She thinks that she's a person who is inconvenienced. But a sound argument would say that there is a formal fallacy of logic here. Logical fallacies are things we'll talk about. I might do another video eventually on this. Logical fallacy here is that the premises are not true. This one is not true. This one is true. So since this one is not true and this one is true, they don't add up. All men being mortal, for the most part, we with some claims to the contrary, from certain religious groups in comic books, graphic movies, etc., graphic novels, we know that all men are mortal. Socrates is a man and Socrates is dead. So that demonstrates his mortality. So that would be a sound argument. Ruby is not a cat. She isn't a person, even though she protests that particular claim on her part. But Ruby is a dog. So the Socrates argument, that is valid and sound. The Ruby cat dog thing argument is valid but not sound. I want you to think about that. When you're making your arguments, I want you to look at your premises to see if they're true. And I'd like you to back them up. Back up your arguments. It's important to do your homework and back up what you're saying. And one thing that we like to do, and this is why I always do this for exams and projects, when they're take home, of course, and essays, I give a review so I can make comments and I can say, you are not looking at this in a way that most people would look at it, and you might be missing something here. In academia, it's different than other ventures because in other ventures, if somebody corrects you, come on, baby, come on, come on, baby, come on, come here, come here, oh, baby, up, up. She wants to get through. Go. All right, hold on. Sorry, baby. That's the price. Distraction on Ruby's part from my part is the price for waking her up. Okay, she has a dog bed under the desk. So, as I was saying, what was I saying? Okay, so in other ventures, if someone were to correct you, you might take that as an insult. In what we do, we want people to correct us. If it's well meaning and it's someone who knows, might have a better perspective than us because of experience, because of authority, etc., we want someone to correct us. We want them to tear what we're saying apart so we can come up with something better. And that's what I want you to do. I want you to tear your work apart to come up with something better and hand it to me. This is why I do this. This is why I offer an element of review, especially to younger, not younger, to people who are more at the nascent stages of their academic development. Because I don't like throwing people out into the wind and hoping that they do something well. It's cruel and it's stupid. And I like working with my students because, it might take a little more time on my part, but frankly, I want you to leave my class and my instruction knowing how to do something really well. I want to leave you prepared. And with political science, it's not just it leaves you prepared to move on to another college or graduate, it prepares you for life. So with your inferences, there's another two types of reasoning that I want to bring up, and these are the ampliative. These are the ones that, while we know about the general and we try to make conclusions about a particular case based on the general, this is going from the bottom up. This is going from the perspective of, I noticed a particular case, as opposed to I noticed the general, so I'm going to describe the case. I noticed a particular case, so I'm going to venture to describe the general. And with this, keeping in mind, we have deduction and the ampliative. So this is top down, this is bottom up. And from this, we have two types of reasoning. We have inductive and abductive. Inductive takes an element of the whole and tries to say you understand the whole because you understand the particular. Deductive says that I understand the whole, so therefore I can understand the particular, as opposed to I understand the particular, so I know something about the whole. This can lead to a lot of problems because you're making some really wild assumptions sometimes. Like with inductive reasoning, this particular thing, it it might lead to a lot of false conclusions. For example, you know, I ate at that restaurant 6 months ago and I got sick, so I never want to go back to any of that restaurant. Let's say that you ate at a McDonald's and you happen to feel sick the next day. I'm not going to say Taco Bell because everyone feels sick after Taco Bell. I'm kidding. I love the fresco style black bean crunch wrap supreme. If you're a vegan, the best fast food place for you. Anyway, so let's say I got sick um, after eating at a McDonald's. Therefore, McDonald's has bad standards, so I won't eat at any McDonald's. Well, that's not necessarily true. You could have gotten sick for a lot of reasons. It might not have been food poisoning from that restaurant. You might have inadvertently drinking out of a container at your house that had some kind of detergent in it. And that might have caused you to get sick. You might have caught a bug from a friend or your significant other. You might have been making out with your significant other and they had some kind of gastrointestinal thing that was transmissible to you. And because you made out with your significant other, you caught a stomach bug. It might have been McDonald's, but we don't know that for sure. Inductive doesn't mean that it's not a way to determine something. We can make some pretty cool conclusions from it. But this leads us, you can't always assume that you know everything about the whole because of the particular. Abductive takes a different type of reasoning structure and it says, oh, it's wet outside, it must have rained. We're not necessarily going to go down that. Um, Sherlock Holmes, everyone knows Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is said to deduce, but he does more abduction. And looking at this, looking at logic, looking at validity, looking at soundness, looking at all of this, I want you to consider one last thing, and this is statistics. This is statistics, and I'm not going to go that sophisticated into it, but let's say that we have a claim here, okay? This is based on probability. So we have a claim. And the claim is true or it's false. And so I'm going to not reject the claim and I'm going to reject the claim. And if we look at this through statistics, if we fail to reject a claim and the claim is true, then it's correct. If we fail to reject a claim and it's false, it is incorrect. If we reject a claim and it's true, that's incorrect. And if we fail to reject the claim and it's false, it's correct. I mean, this makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. So, a type 1 error is if we reject a claim that winds up being true. Type 1 error. This is what we call a false positive. And when we work in the social and behavioral sciences, we're working from probabilities. And we say within what degree of certainty, yada, yada, yada. This is a type 2 error. It's a false negative. False negatives are, they're both bad. But like you think about medicine and you've taken COVID tests before, and you might have come up as positive on a COVID test, but you don't have COVID. So you go and you take another test to make sure. Or what winds up happening is you have COVID and you're infectious and you come up negative. That's a false negative. But remember this: type 1, type 2 errors. You're probably going to go into statistics later, but looking at that, we can reject claims that are false and we can reject claims that are true. And we can fail to reject claims that are false and we can fail to reject claims that are true. The whole reason I'm going over this is that there are models to look at to figure out if we're venturing down a particular claim to tell us if it might be true or it might not. And we also have different persuasive mechanisms to try to encourage someone to accept the same notion that we're trying to promote. And I want you to think about this when you're making your claims. I need you to think about this because I'm going to be thinking about it like that. I'm going to be thinking about what could possibly tear apart your argument. I also think in terms of something else. A counterfactual. A counterfactual is something that didn't happen, but it's another example. I try to think of other examples to say, is the thing that you're trying to persuade me absolutely true? Is it sound? Are there any other examples that can offer insight that could undermine your claim? Like I said earlier, it's called the smell test. I want to see if it can pass the smell test. Ultimately, that's where if it just smells funny, if there's any doubt, there's no doubt. Kidding. Doubt is good. Doubt's very good. And when we're making claims and we're building up to these arguments, especially asking about, well, do you agree with James Madison in his assertion that to preserve liberty, we have to harness faction rather than eradicate faction by getting everyone of the same opinion or by preventing opinion. Do you agree with him? And you can make a whole host of arguments for or against that. I'm not going to grade you negatively based on taking a particular position. It's supporting what you're saying that's going to lead to how I'm going to evaluate you. Additionally, we have methods to make it easier to write and to scribble down and to evaluate. This is called plug and chug. Plug and chug is basically you come up with an outline, you put in your claims and the substantiary evidence and you see if it makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, you can go back and figure out where you went wrong. And in the process, you might go in under a particular conclusion or a number of conclusions. And with those, you could ultimately find that your argument was not valid or sound to begin with. And this is great. I mean, in terms of publishing, there's not a lot of articles that get published saying that, well, we didn't find this to be true or we didn't find anything here, which I think is sad because those are incredibly useful. We only see